is Clare and I'm the Director of the Institute of English Studies at the School of Advanced Study, the University of London. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the very first panel in the very first week of the School of Advanced Studies Peer Review Week, a week in which we are exploring peer review from a range of perspectives for a range of audiences. Peer Review 1 today we'll concentrate on articles and books, and we will have 3 speakers, each of whom will speak for 15 minutes about their experience and recommendations, advice about peer review where articles and books are concerned. The second event will be on Wednesday at the same time, also aimed at early career researchers, and that will be on research grants. But to bring us back to this morning, our 3 speakers are experts and long-standing, highly experienced scholars in their own fields, as well as having a range of experience where editing, writing and reviewing articles and books are concerned. I'll introduce the speakers first and then we'll go straight into the presentation. Before we start, just a quick reminder that we have disabled the Q&A, but we are opening up the chat. So if you want to post comments throughout this session, please do go ahead and I'll pick them up towards the end of this panel session when we can have a discussion. So our speakers are 3 professors. Professor Sarah Churchwell, who is the Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities and Professorial Fellow in the Institute of English Studies. Our next speaker is Emeritus Professor of Renaissance Philosophy and Honorary Fellow in the Warburg Institute, Jill Kraye. Welcome to both of you. And our final speaker is Professor Carl Stychin, who is Director of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies and a long-standing editor of social and legal studies, amongst many other things. So we have experts from 3 different disciplines within the humanities and a broader range, and each of them have been asked by the organisers to consider 5 things they'd most wished they'd known as an early career scholar entering the world of peer review. So we'll start with Sarah. Over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks everyone for coming. I suppose that I should say that the very first thing I wish I'd known, because when I was in ECR we didn't always do slides, and I'm so old school. I don't always put up slides, so I should have. I do have bullet points here, which I hope will be okay. But I can also I can turn them into a slideshow if that's helpful if people want them shared afterwards. So sorry for that. Still kind of my fallback position. So what I wanted to and as Claire said, we're really thinking about this as a series of conversations for ECRs in particular. So I want to think a little bit about transitioning from being a postgraduate student, doing your Viva, and then what it feels like to enter into the peer review process. And when you think about that transition, for me, it's really, I want to stress the keys in the name, right? The 2 words are what we want to think about here. It's peer and it's review. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when you're dealing with feedback and advice from peers, that's a different position than you have when you're dealing with feedback and advice from your teachers or your supervisors. As a student, you're basically trying to do everything you're told, in the hopes of getting a good grade, right? More or less. You're trying to internalize all of the advice that you're getting and then see if you can produce what they're asking you to do. But as a peer, you have more independence, you have more autonomy. So the first thing that I wish I'd known when I went into the peer review process is that I don't have to do everything that the peer reviewer says. Now, that is not advice to reject everything out of hand. On the contrary, but it's to think about it now more as a discussion, as a dialogue, as the beginning of a dialogue with an editor who has already expressed enough interest in your work that they took it out to peer reviews and they want to, so basically start by assuming that the publisher would like, the editor would like to publish your work. And now everybody is working to help you improve it. That's the good faith effort that everybody is entering into there. But you don't have to accept every single piece of advice. So first of all, as I say, it's a dialogue and a discussion, but it can also be a little bit of a debate, a professional debate, a friendly debate. But there are points where you can, push back a little bit if you feel that you need to. So my kind of first point is you don't have to accept everything as gospel word. Part of the reason for thinking in those terms is because one of the things that you'll discover as soon as you enter into it is that the gospel word of the peer reviewers tend to disagree with each other a lot of the time. So you actually can't, with the best will in the world, to do every single thing that they say. Sometimes you can't. You can get mutually contradictory advice in the same reviews. That was literally what happened to me with my first peer-reviewed essay. I was writing on Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and I got a reader's report that said I was bending over backwards to excuse Ted Hughes. And my second reader's report said that I seemed to have a complete, hostile campaign against Ted Hughes, and I obviously wanted to destroy him. And I was like, what do I think? These could not be more mutually contradictory. What do I do with this? And eventually what I did was I realized it was part of my argument. And I actually turned their reports into a footnote. And I said, this is proof of what I'm saying, which is that nobody agrees about Plath and Hughes and everybody turns it into a battle, right? So now that was I think probably an extreme example. That hasn't happened again, but I use it as a test case because it can be that extreme. But often you will get, simple things like it should be longer, it should be shorter, or, don't go to this source or do go to that source. And at first you'll just think, how am I supposed to reconcile these? But that's why the editor is an important person here. The editor is the person that you're entering into the dialogue with even more than the peer reviews. So as I say, it's not a set of instructions. It is advice that has been given by experts in your field usually to the best of their ability. And then your job is to sift through that advice and decide what you want to do with it. My own kind of working process when I get peer reviews is I try to accept the majority of suggestions on principle, on the basis that they're there to help me. It's all too easy to get defensive and to be sure that what I did was the right way, and say, look, these are smart people in my field who want to improve this essay. So in general, I'm going to try to accept all of their advice. Where I accept that I maybe didn't do it right, but I'm not convinced by their suggestion, then I will try to find a third way. And what I'll say is I accept that I shouldn't have done it my way. I'm not convinced by the reviewer's solution, but here's a third solution. And that's what I mean by saying it's a negotiation, to say, can we have a dialogue about this? Can we think about it this way? But there will be points where you fundamentally disagree with a reviewer's advice, and you're allowed to do that. And that's the real difference with it being a peer versus being a teacher-student relationship, that you can say, you know what, on scholarly grounds, I don't accept this principle or this piece of advice, and here's why. I'm actually going with this line of argument, or I'm following this bit of scholarship. Remember that the editor is not necessarily an expert in your field, although they may be. It depends on here partly whether you're working with a scholarly journal where they normally will be, or whether we're talking about a university press where they probably won't be, but they'll know broadly your field. That's what they work in. So you can go back to an editor and say, look, actually there's a specialist argument here, and reviewer X and I are in disagreement, and I'm taking this position. So you can sometimes hold your ground, but as with any negotiation, the more that you try to say my way or the highway, the less likely people are going to want to work with you. And remember again that everybody is trying to help improve your article, or your book. So it is in your best interest to try to take as much advice on board as you can. So that's broadly the first point. The other points will be quicker because that has a lot of kind of context to it as well. But the second point that I think is really important is that publishing is a business, and this includes academic presses. And it's something that academics are not trained to think about, and we're not necessarily very adept at thinking about. Now, so this next set of remarks is more applicable to books than it is to journal articles, but it's not inapplicable to journal articles either. they need to know, but particularly when we're talking about book publishing, even with a university press, they are in a commercial marketplace. They are not educational charities. So they need to know if there's a market for this book. If you're being asked to do peer reviewing, you're kind of a market focus group. You're basically like the expert. And they're asking you, you know, like a dentist, would you recommend this toothpaste to your clients? Like, that's what it is. You're just coming in and saying, is this something that is useful in this market, where the market is a specialist academic area of expertise that you are also an expert in. So, and as a writer, then you're trying to convince them that your toothpaste is the one that they want to, you know, bring into the marketplace. And I'm being deliberately banal here, right? I'm deliberately trying to demystify it. Sometimes we're just selling toothpaste, you know, sometimes that's all that we're doing. But of course, we're trying to make the absolutely best toothpaste that we can and save everybody's teeth. And we want to have like the scientifically advanced toothpaste that nobody's ever tried before, right? So, but you need to think about it in terms of who you're trying to sell this book to. And who you're trying to get to read your journal article. You need to think about what books or articles are out there that are like yours and how yours is differentiated. When, as a student, at doing the PhD, you're asked to think about how original your research is, but you have to start switching now into thinking also about its usefulness to the field. So originality per se may not be enough to get you over the line. Now it may be, especially if it's wildly original, then it probably will be. But if it is original but not necessarily filling a gap, not necessarily reaching a target audience, then you may find that harder, particularly, as I say, with book publishing, to get over the line. Your publisher will be thinking about potential audiences, and they will ask the peer reviewer to comment on potential readership. They will ask the reviewer, will you assign this to your students? They will ask, you know, is this for postgraduates or undergraduates? And they will want you to understand its chances in the marketplace. So writing a peer review is not very different from writing a book review, actually, except that you're being asked to improve its chances before it gets published, rather than just comment on its success once it has been published. So it's somewhere between the reader's report that you got on your Viva and a book review is where the peer review sits. As I said, the peer review process is not mystical, right? People are being asked their professional opinions every step of the way. It is true that some individuals may take this as an opportunity to be petty about an individual aspect of their research. People hear those stories and people start to think that that's what the peer review process is like. It can happen. Peer reviewers are human beings and they're not always at their absolute best. So you have to be, you know, prepared for that kind of thing. But in my experience, and as Claire says, I mean, I think all three of us here have had a lot of experience with this. Pettiness is very much not the norm in my experience. It is very much an aberration, and it's unfortunate when it happens. But by and large, people doing peer reviewing, look, they're doing it for free or for not very much at all. They're doing it because they love the subject and they want to improve the field. And so they're doing it out of good faith, as I said, and genuinely trying to help improve an essay or a book. Most editors will send you a list of questions to consider if you are peer reviewing, and most of them will share with you when you are writing what some of the things are that they ask from the peer reviewer. So again, it's not too invisible a process. You have a sense of the questions that are being asked and the answers that you need to give. But most experienced reviewers also develop a set of their own questions. And so I thought I would just end with some of those, what I think about when I'm reviewing, and then I will hand over to Jill. So as I said, and I think this is a really important one, it's no longer just a question of whether it makes an original contribution, but I start to ask questions about whether it makes a relevant contribution. Does it make a necessary intervention in the field, or does it replicate what is already out there with maybe some minor tinkering? Does it make an argument that is so niche that maybe, you know, a majority of readers may not find it important. Now there you're making a judgment call as an expert, because you may feel that even though it's very niche, it's actually incredibly important to your specialist subject. And as a peer reviewer, you can work to try to convince the editor to say, look, I know this may not be your widest market, but this is such an important intervention in this field. You really need to get this out there, and you want to be the publisher who does that. So it's not to say that those kinds of arguments can't be successful, but you need to be cognizant of them and thinking about how you position your work in relationship to kind of what kinds of interventions you're trying to make in the field. As I said, you need to be clear about what your readership is. This is a professional and as I say, a commercial transaction. And again, these are sometimes academics can think of these as dirty words, but it is. So is it an undergraduate audience? Is it a postgraduate audience? Do you think that courses will take it up? Can you say to your editor, these are the kinds of courses that I think will want to buy my book. These are this again comes in less with journal articles, but this is why I think this article matters to this audience. And then as a reviewer, I ask myself, is it targeted appropriately for that audience? If it says it's for an undergraduate audience, is it accessible to an undergraduate audience, or has it been read for hyper specialists and vice versa? If it's being positioned to be part of a series, how does it fit in that series? So you ask some kind of overview questions as well. Also, does it have a shelf life? Will it date? Is it highly topical? Or is it actually making an important contribution that can last over time? And then they will always ask you about major competitors, because again, they're thinking in commercial terms. So they want to know, is there something else out there that's like this? And they also often want to know, are you, one way I've seen it framed, which I find really helpful, is, are you intervening in a field that is expanding or contracting? Because they want to see if this is opening something up that has potential for more transformative interventions that they could be making. So I'll stop there, but I just want to end by stressing that, to me, the most important things in this transition are to bear in mind that you're now entering into a commercial relationship, but with people who want you to succeed. And so the emphasis is on peer, the emphasis is on thinking of it as a review and as an opportunity for you to improve, but recognizing now that there are practical considerations that were not necessarily as front and center as they were when you were working as a student. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to what everybody else has to say. I'm sure you've all done slides like professionals. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That's a great way to start. Proceed in good faith, understand your editor, enter a debate and a discussion, know your audience, have awareness of the significance as well as the originality of your work. With that in mind, let's pass over to Jill.
A lot of what I'm going to say is going to repeat and I hope reinforce what Sarah said. But what I want to talk about, as you see from my title, is my perspective as an editor and what I, as an editor, am looking for. And these hints are both for writing peer reviews, which even as an early career person, you'll be asked to do, and also responding to them. Now, just to quickly establish my credentials as an editor, I'm one of the editors of the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes, which is a SAS publication in-house, but also I'm an editor of the International Journal of the Classical Tradition, which is published by Springer, which is a German-British global academic press. I'm also a book series editor, 2 Warburg series. One is Warburg Colloquia, where we publish the papers from conferences that happened at the Warburg, and also Warburg Institute Studies and Texts, where we publish monographs and editions. And you can see these are very specialist publications, but that's my experience over a number of years. Now, the first stage of the peer review process is when the editor selects potential reviewers and invites them to evaluate a submission, usually providing an abstract and sometimes indicating the length of the piece. Now, when you receive such a request, which you will even as an early career reviewer from time to time, it's because an editor like me has identified you as someone with the appropriate expertise to review the piece of work. Now, sometimes we editors get this wrong. So you may feel that you're unqualified to judge the work that you've been asked to review. If so, you should, of course, decline. But if you can recommend other more qualified reviewers, I can assure you that editors will be extremely grateful for the advice, since you're far more likely to know the field than they are. So they really appreciate it. And you shouldn't worry that you might get blamed by the people you recommend for suggesting them. It would be a breach of confidentiality for editors to reveal information about how they've come to select peer reviewers. Another reason for declining to review a submission is that you can't make the deadline you've been given by an editor. Deadlines, however, are sometimes negotiable. So if you want to write a review and you think you could do it with an extension of a few weeks or even a month, it's definitely worth writing to the editor and explaining the situation. Editors are often prepared to be flexible, especially if they've had difficulty, as is often the case, in finding appropriate reviewers. But if there's really no chance that you can make the deadline, once again, any recommendations of other reviewers you can offer to the editor will be warmly received. An issue which isn't usually explicitly mentioned when requesting a peer review, but which you should bear in mind, is whether you have a conflict of interest. That is, whether there's anything which might prevent you from writing an impartial or objective review. In some cases, the conflict of interest is very obvious. For instance, if you've already peer reviewed the piece for another journal or publisher, if you've previously read the piece at the request of the author or have contributed substantial help or advice, if the author is a close colleague in your department, or in the case of SAS, your institute, or either a good friend or a bitter enemy of yours. There is a very large gray area, however, and everyone tends to draw the line differently. So my counsel would be that if you think you may have a conflict of interest, for example, you've heard the author deliver a paper on the same subject at a conference 2 years ago, it's best to set out the circumstances to the editor and let him or her decide. In my experience, as often as not, the issues potential reviewers are concerned about turn out to be not serious enough for me to regard them as a conflict of interest. Now, the International Journal of the Classical Tradition, like many other journals these days, uses Editorial Manager, which is an online workflow management system. Scholar One is another widely used system. When peer reviewers agree to review a submission, they're asked to log in to Editorial Manager and are directed to this page. In the top section, comments to the editor, reviewers indicate whether a paper is acceptable for publication with major or minor revisions or unacceptable. In the comments to the author section below, reviewers are left to their own devices to write whatever general comments or specific suggestions they might have. Since peer reviews are always supposed to be blind, in this section, reviewers shouldn't include anything which might reveal their identity to the author and should obviously avoid making any insulting or offensive remarks. That said, it's the editor's responsibility to check this section carefully and to remove or tone down any inappropriate comments. Now, the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institute is rather more old-fashioned, and we don't use any automated workflow systems, at least for now. Instead, the journal secretary writes to reviewers and gives them some guidelines. Many of the points on this list are straightforward and would be applicable to any academic journal. It's worthwhile, however, for reviewers to look out for questions which are a little out of the ordinary, such as here asking about the author's familiarity with primary sources in their original language, since these are likely to be of particular interest to the editors. The question, does the submission justify its length, aims to get the reviewer to say whether the piece is longer than its content and significance merit. The most common problem nowadays with journal submissions is that authors frequently inflate what should be a note into an article, or pump up a reasonable length article into an oversized one, which may even exceed the journal's word limit. Peer reviewers should always be alert to this tendency and call it out, whether or not they're specifically asked to comment on it. What editors really like are reviews that are as detailed and specific as possible, above all when reviewers are recommending major or minor revisions. It's not very helpful for a reviewer to write, for instance, that the coverage of secondary literature is incomplete or not up to date, without citing at least some examples of the missing or outdated literature. And if possible, it's preferable to give a proper bibliographical reference rather than just saying that the author does not mention the work of X, Y, or Z. Reviewers sometimes hesitate between recommending major or minor revisions. This is fair enough, and as long as they make sufficiently clear what they think the author needs to do in order for the piece to be acceptable, it's okay to leave it up to the editor to decide whether the requested revisions are major or minor. Some reviewers are reluctant to reject submissions, either because they consider it to be cruel or because they don't want to blight someone's academic career. So they recommend major revisions instead of rejection. It's much better for all concerned, however, to be decisive and to reject a piece that deserves rejection. This will not only make the editor's decision easier, but also prevent the author from wasting time on a revision, which in the end will probably be rejected. Nor should reviewers feel guilty about harming an author's prospects, since the final judgment as to the article's fate will be made by the editor, who will be relying on at least one other peer review. Peer reviewers can also be asked to evaluate special issues of journals or volumes of conference papers. The scholarly criteria are much the same as for individual articles, but there are some additional points to consider, such as thematic coherence of the papers, whether any of them should be rejected, and whether there are gaps which need to be filled by commissioning further contributions. Here too, reviewers shouldn't feel any qualms about singling out weak papers for rejection, since this will help to ensure the value of the special issue or volume is not lowered by subpar contributions. I've included this slide to give you an idea of the type of questions which large commercial academic publishers ask peer reviewers about manuscripts and proposals. And these are basically the same questions that Sarah mentioned. And I just quickly to say they want to know whether it's solid and properly documented, whether it makes a real contribution, whether it repeats other works, how it compares to recent publications, the readership it's aimed at, major flaws of fact, whether it's libelous or possibly plagiarized, and finally, whether it's written in good idiomatic English. And peer reviewers aren't obliged to answer all these questions, but in general, it's a good idea to use the framework provided by the publisher. I want to conclude by giving a few tips about peer reviewing to authors, again, from my perspective as an editor. Occasionally, authors submitting papers to journals provide editors with a list of peer reviewers they think would be suitable. Personally, I find this a pretty dicey tactic and almost always ignore such recommendations, so I'd advise against it. If, however, an author asks that a specific person should not be selected as a reviewer, I invariably comply with this request. There are circumstances when there's a problem between an author and a potential reviewer, and it's legitimate for the author to signal this to the editor without even having to give an explanation. But don't try and get away with giving a long list of reviewers you want to be excluded. Keep it to one, ideally, and not more. Now, if you as an author have a submission rejected, you should not, under any circumstances, immediately fire off an angry letter to the editor, complaining about the unfair treatment you've received and raging about the incompetence of the peer reviewers. Trust me, this never does any good and will earn you a reputation as a difficult character whom editors are not keen to deal with in the future. Dignified silence is the best response to a rejection. Then, after a period of calm reflection, you can consider whether the peer reviewer's criticisms are valid, revise your piece accordingly, and resubmit it elsewhere. If you're asked to make minor revisions, these will normally be relatively small corrections and changes, which you should implement without quibbling, unless you're certain that the reviewer is wrong, in which case you should let the editor know why you're not making the requested revision. If, on the other hand, you're asked to make major revisions, you may feel unable to comply with all the suggestions of the peer reviewers, who, as Sarah said, are not always in agreement as to what they want altered. My advice is, which is the same as Sarah's really, is to show willing by taking on board as many of the changes recommended by the peer reviewers as you can. And as with minor revisions, explaining to the editor tactfully and without abusing the peer reviewers why you've chosen not to adopt some of their recommendations. If you accept the majority of the peer reviewers' suggested revisions, editors usually feel that you've done enough and will accept your paper. And on that positive note, I'll end my talk here.
Thank you so much, Jill. It's great to have that perspective from your experience as an editor and to have insight into how to do peer reviews as well as how to accept them. And I couldn't agree more with the advice to, if you are invited to do a peer review, be decisive, be detailed, and actually be clear. I think that both in terms of writing them and also responding to them. So that was really helpful. So at this point, I will hand over to our third speaker, Carl Stychin. And Carl, I think you too have some PowerPoints for us. So we'll indulge in sharing your screen.
Okay. Let me just. Great. I hope you can see that. Let me just go into present mode. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think my comments, I hope, will dovetail what's already been said, with which I fully agree. I've been the editor of the journal Social and Legal Studies for a number of years. We're a generalist interdisciplinary law journal. So we receive submissions from scholars within law schools, but an array of other disciplines working on legal discourse. We're a bit unusual. We're published by Sage. We use the Scholar One submission system. We're a bit unusual in that we're founded very much as a collective, an editorial collective. So we review, do a lot of our reviewing within the collective itself. So part of my job is to really manage this process and flow. We do sometimes go externally for reviews as well. One thing I would point out is the challenge, and I think especially at the moment, but more generally, and I know this is a subject for another session, is around the length of time it may take to get reviews, which I think can both build up the author's anticipation, possibly nervousness around when they finally get the reviews and the decision. When that happens, I would suggest my first piece of advice is to read the reviews carefully and read the cover letter from the editor carefully and reflect on them. I think this is where taking some time to reflect can be very important, depending, of course, on what it actually says. And as others have said, I think you have to take an honest view on whether criticisms are well-founded. And also, I would suggest it can be useful to get a trusted sort of critical friend to read these with you, to give advice, someone who has a little bit of distance from it. And now, if the reviews are positive, well, that's great. And by positive, I include quite minor revisions here, and I would suggest you celebrate because that's quite an achievement. If it's a rejection, in a sense, that's clear cut. And the question I think becomes, are the comments constructive and can you make use of them in moving forward? Hopefully you can. Again, this is where having a little bit of time can be really useful in order to kind of absorb the comments, get a bit of distance from your work as well. The interesting issue, I think, is around that middle ground, uh, where you're asked and invited to embark upon a revision process. I think for me, one of the first questions as an author you need to understand, and I think this is where an editor's cover letter should be clear, is around exactly what kind of revisions are being asked for. Are these minor or are these major? Or indeed, is it somewhere in between very minor and major? And also, what is the process that revisions will be subjected to when you resubmit? Is it going to go back to peer review? Is the editor going to read it over and make a decision as to whether the concerns have been sufficiently answered? Or is it a fait accompli and you're simply being asked to take on board what you think is justified? So overall, I would say take time and reflect on the comments and what is being asked of you and get advice, possibly go back to that editor for advice. Having been an editor for a number of years, I think the common criticisms that I see and these are 5 of them, for why work is criticized through peer review. The first one is I think that I would sum up as work is submitted that really isn't ready for submission, not yet ready for peer review. It's premature. The work needed to have been read by more critical friends, more feedback given. It just needs more work. I read a piece yesterday, in fact, that I think fell into this category. Lots of interesting ideas in it, but just didn't feel tight enough in how it was conceived and written. It just needed more time. The pot needed to be on the stove for longer before the work was submitted. I also see a lot of work that's submitted that's not a good match for the journal. And I must say, I'm finding that there is a lot of work that I'm not even sending to peer review because it's not an appropriate match. I think this is where online submission systems do give rise to a certain amount of work that's just being sent here, there, and everywhere. Please, so really avoid that. Really understand the journal that you're submitting to. I think another issue is around novelty, where the contribution of the piece may not be sufficiently clear, where the argument may not be sufficiently convincing. And this, again, I think is where having received good feedback from colleagues and friends, academic friends prior to submission is really important. Really tighten up that argument before it's submitted. There may be reasons why people are submitting work before it's really ready, but and certainly something I think early in my career I was guilty of, but I do think try to tighten it up as much as possible. I think finally, we see methodological weaknesses that come out in work. And this is a really tough issue because I'm often asked how much of the methodological underpinnings should be explicit in the work. And the answer isn't a very satisfactory one for me because it's usually you need enough, but not too much in terms of how much to actually explain. This is very discipline specific, but again, it's something that maybe is best understood by looking at work in that particular journal that's been published. And that, I think, is a general tip, is to really have read the work in a journal, to really feel you understand that journal and where it's coming from. It's perfectly acceptable. We've talked a lot about resubmitting work and how much what a good faith resubmission is, but it's also, I think, perfectly acceptable to decide not to resubmit work, even if you've been invited to do it. Again, this depends on discipline and a journal. As a journal, Social and Legal Studies tends to view itself as being a very supportive journal towards authors. This is one reason I like it. But as a consequence, we will often we give a lot of papers. We end up with a lot of papers in that major revision category, often with what I would call an expectation of deep revision, really a reworking, a restructuring, even rethinking of the paper. Now that's can be problematic, because that can mean at times that what's being suggested is a different project than the author intended. And I think as an author, you have to be prepared to make a decision that what's being asked is not your project, that you feel it would weaken the structure and the argument of the paper, and that you could actually end up with a kind of mishmash that's not really satisfactory to anybody. Peer review is not a perfect system. It's a judgment call. And I do remember peer reviewing a paper quite some time ago now, but it stands out in my memory, where I was requested deep revision, revise and resubmit. The author did do what I suggested, and this was really difficult because what came back was still not satisfactory, but not satisfactory for different reasons. So that was quite a difficult process. So I think you have to be honest with yourself and ask yourself if you can face what's being asked of you and whether you can be true to yourself. Can the changes actually be implemented in your view? Would it be a different paper? Now, sometimes that's a good thing. And I have, as an author, I've sometimes felt I was being asked to write a different paper, but it turned out to be exactly the right thing to be asked to do. And I was very happy with the outcome. It's a lot of, you have to be prepared for it to be real work, significant work. And you have to be prepared, I think, to sometimes get some distance from the work and come back to it, because you can't face major revisions at that particular moment. So I think that's perfectly acceptable, to take a break from the paper and then return to it. And even if you don't resubmit, those reviews can still be hopefully incredibly useful to you. But if you do resubmit, and this is where I would agree with what others have said, you need to really engage with reviews, try to do what the reviewer asks, where it's not possible to really justify your decision. And this I think is my strongest recommendation of all. And it's something that I think authors have become much more skilled at doing, is your cover letter back on resubmission, which is I believe is incredibly important. The author's response on resubmission. Provide a detailed explanation as to what you did, what you didn't do, and why. In fact, in my from my experience, I think people are getting real. This is becoming something that's become a real skill set in itself. They're getting longer, they're getting more detailed. They are turning into sort of grids of what was asked and how I replied. But I do think that's very helpful. It really shows engagement. and it shows that you haven't taken shortcuts, hopefully. And of course, it's a real example of professionalism. And as others have said, throughout this process, do be polite and professional. It really makes a big difference. I expect reviewers to be polite and professional, and I expect authors to be as well. I know it can be painful. I feel the pain. I've experienced it. But do try to maintain that stance of professionalism. So for my final do's on resubmission, demonstrate that you've made a good faith effort to respond to the reviews, provide a detailed cover letter with your resubmission, and take sufficient time before resubmitting. This is something that now obviously if it's minor revisions, then I would say get them done as quickly as possible. But if what's being asked for are major revisions involving restructuring, reworking, rethinking, take time. It's, I manage our Sage Track system, our Scholar One system. When I see a revised submission come back very quickly, when I know that's what's been asked for is quite significant, quite major, it makes my heart sink, because I think this author hasn't really taken on board the scale of significance of what's been asked. This is also, I think, where the cover letter is important, back to the author, to say, look, this is what's being asked of you. I also think with the cover letter to the author, a good editor, I think, will actually try to synthesize the peer reviews, try to make sense of what, as Sarah pointed out, can be contradictions, and try to map a way forward, not in a prescriptive fashion, but hopefully in a helpful fashion. My don'ts, I would say don't make changes that you can't live with. So once again, be true to yourself. Try not to engage in shortcuts when deep revision is required. People can see through that. Reviewers can see through that on peer review of a resubmission. Don't give up on a paper. It may have to be set aside for a while, but it is remarkable how when you come back to something after a period of time, you can see it more clearly, and you can see what needs to be done more clearly. And as others have said, don't be unprofessional in your response. It can be difficult, I know from experience, but do try your best to take the high road. And I think that's all I'm going to say. So I'll turn it back over to Claire, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks very much, Carl. I think actually, I think all three of the speakers today have touched on areas of common ground, but also contributed details and advice to fill out a more rounded picture of what peer review is and what it should be and how it works. In Carl's case, I just want to pick out 3 points. The importance of time, being timely in providing a peer review and responding to requests for a peer review, both as a courtesy to the editors, but also as a courtesy to the author, who is often waiting anxiously for that review, but also taking your time once you receive that review. That's particularly important, I think, to allow time to absorb it. And I think Carl's point of suggestion of having a critical friend on hand. I don't think I've ever thought of the people that I call on to read my peer reviews as critical friends before, but I know I need them. So I think that's extremely good advice. Also, I just want to timeliness, but also the importance of the cover letter, both the cover letter that the editor sends out with the peer reviews, but also the author's response I think those 2 points are very well taken. And finally, and I think I'm picking this up across all 3 now, but Carl made the point very nicely, the importance of engaging with the process, because it's about professionalism and about joining a community of writers, readers, and authors who are engaged on a common endeavour. And we've got some questions coming up in the chat, which I will turn to in a minute, of the tricky things, and I'll call those out in a minute. But I thought it might be quite helpful to step back and just to ask the panelists in one sentence why peer review is important in the first place. What does peer review give us? So I think I'll ask, maybe I'll turn to Jill first for that, and then pick it up after that.
Well, if you edit a journal that like I do, which covers everything from antiquity to the 20th century, even if you have 4 editors, there's no way you can have the expertise. So it's absolutely essential to know that a work has scholarly credibility and that it's been through the eyes of at least 2 people who know the field. Without that, you're really on very thin ice. So I would say it's essential. Okay, so thank you, Jill. It's essential. Carl, maybe I'll go to you next. Why is peer review important?
Well, someone I know once said, peer review is a terrible system. Unfortunately, everything else is even worse.
Yes.
So, it's obviously, it can be an imperfect system. It's certainly a labor-intensive system, but it is a gold standard of quality if it's operating effectively, and it should lead to better work.
I think that's the most important thing. It should lead to better work, and that's what we all want. But I also agree that it's an imperfect system, but it's the best we've got. Nobody's come up with anything better so far. Sarah.
Well, I absolutely agree with all of that. And as I said at the beginning, this is about trying to improve the work. Everybody is coming together to try to improve the work. Peer review is like a critical friend, but with more criticism and more distance. It's the same process. It's how can people who understand the field help you make your work better? That's what everybody is trying to do. So that's the main thing. But I would also say that the fact is particularly with books, they're going to get, in most cases, they will get reviewed anyway. So you're only just deferring the process. And in the case of some books, you will defer that process, to a very public place, and suddenly you'll get that peer review, in front of more of your peers. So actually, I think the more that you can look on it as a safety net that's designed to help make sure that your work is up to that gold standard that Carl is talking about before it goes out to public readers, because you will also often get reviewed after the fact. And it's a lot more brutal in that environment. It is way more brutal in that environment. So, and I think that's a really, really important consideration. If you want, the key is in the word publishing. Why do you want to make this public? If you want to make it public, it is presumably because you want to enter into a dialogue with other people who are interested in the subject and therefore are also experts on the subject. It is not your opportunity to have the last word. And so peer review is a necessary first part of putting you through that process, which can be humbling, but is also always a learning experience. And as we're all saying, is almost always to the benefit of the work in question.
Okay, thank you. It looks like peer review is going to be around a bit longer, so we will continue to understand it and work within the system. There's some questions coming up in the chat around a number of kind of hot spots in the peer review process that I think it's worth raising here. One is a question about, is a major revision actually a rejection? And maybe as Jill, I'll ask you that first, because that is, you did mention about the kind of grey area here. And Carl also mentioned, well, there are times when a major revision might prompt you to say, that's not the right, I'm not writing the right piece for this journal. So maybe I'll start with Jill in this case.
I think there's no straight answer. It sometimes varies. In the Warburg journal, what we do is, if the major revision we reasonably expect that this can be done, we indicate that when it's revised, it will be evaluated by the editors. If we think it's more serious, we say it will be reevaluated, but also resubmitted to peer review. And that's a kind of signal that there are two different levels of major revision. So it doesn't always mean rejection, but sometimes if the editors say we're going to submit it again to peer review, this means that you're probably going to have to dig a bit deeper and make a more serious revision. But on the other hand, as I said, there is still hope if you get major revision. If you get rejection, forget it, you've got to go someplace else. So I don't think they're equivalent, but there are degrees of major revision.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Carl, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is where each journal is a bit different, and where it's important to be clear on process. Social and legal studies, a lot of the papers we published started out as quite major revision, and we've worked quite closely with the authors. That's partly because we are an editorial board that's very engaged. So it's not a rejection, but there's the expectation of real engagement. We actually have sort of three categories that I work with: major, which is back to peer review with the same peer reviewers; minor, and a kind of middle ground where I say, I will reread the paper, what you've done, and to see if you've made a good faith effort to respond, to make clear that it's not a cursory reading that's going to be involved.
Okay, yeah, I really like the idea of editorial collectives if you have the capacity to do that, because it allows you, as you say, to work with the author. A related question that's come up a couple of times in the chat, and another good question, and one that I'm sure we all know as well, is what do you do if reader 1 loves it and reader 2 hates it? I'm kind of being crass there, but I think that's a classic scenario, at least in my publishing history. It's a classic scenario. Sarah, as you started us off talking about the importance of entering into discussion and debate, perhaps you could talk about reader A, love, reader B, hate, or vice versa, and what you do when you're faced with that apparent split.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important, as you say, it happens all the time. So the first thing to do is not panic and not think that something has gone wrong. It's actually quite common. Often the editor will give you a steer because they will recognize that they are sending you two mutually incompatible reports. And so they will engage with that beforehand, and they'll give you a sense of what they're suggesting that you do. Sometimes they may commission a third review to split the difference. And they'll let you know that. But if they feel that they can't kind of see their way through it, then this is exactly the kinds of conversation and discussion that I think all three of us have been talking about. That's the point at which you begin a conversation with the editor. And remember, you can ask questions. Again, the editor wants to help you. So just say, okay, and as Carl is stressing, take the time, think about it. Don't just fire off an email saying, these are contradictory. What am I supposed to do? But reflect on it, see if you can find a way forward. And if you genuinely can't find one, then enter into a dialogue with the editor saying, I'm just not sure how to resolve. So resolve the ones where you can, and then where you can't see how to resolve their points of view, just take it back to the editor and say, I'm really trying to make sense of this, but it's not clear to me how I should do this. But generally what they will say is when it comes back to you is they will say, clearly at that point, they're still minded to want to publish it, right? So again, I would say, remember that this is an opportunity for you to persuade the editor that, as everybody's been saying, you're somebody they want to work with, which is why the professionalism is absolutely crucial, that you're somebody who is willing to work with them and to meet everybody halfway. And then to say, okay, so how can we make this possible? So the editor is going to want to lean toward the good review, but they have to take into account the bad review. And so that's where you guys have to enter into a conversation. There's no right way to do it. But as we say, it happens all the time. And those essays end up being published. So don't take that as the kiss of death. Don't see it as something that's impossible. Try to take the negative feedback on board as constructive criticism and try to work with it and improve on that basis. And then, as I say, the editor may well decide that they want to send it back either to a third reviewer, or as Carl was saying, sometimes they'll send it back to the initial reviewer and say, are you persuaded that your concerns have been met?
Jill, you were nodding away. Do you want to come in?
I agree with that, but in some cases where we've had two contradictory reviews and commissioned a third, we get a third opinion that disagrees with both of them. So it doesn't always resolve the problem. But I would strongly, as an editor, say, you know, write back and say, here's what I'm suggesting to do. Do you agree with that? Rather than, and you know, if you're doing something in revision that you're a bit doubtful for, editors will respond if you ask them, should I do this or should I do that? And then you can save a lot of time not doing something that in the end they're not going to accept. So say, I've looked at the two, this is where I think I should revise it. Do you think this is the right approach? And I think that would save everybody a lot of time and effort if people did that, rather than deciding, okay, I'm just going to ignore the negative one and go with the positive one.
Sometimes the negative one is a helpful way to read the positive one, paradoxically. So if you
praise is nice, but criticism is useful.
Yeah. Carl, anything to add?
I agree with everything that's been said. I think a good editor helps to guide that process. Given as a journal, because of our structure, sometimes I will go back to the reviewer if I have that contradiction. I will sometimes go back to the reviewers to try to understand more clearly where the contradiction lies. I mean, as a board, some of my colleagues really enjoy the opportunity to discuss with each other the papers, which these can lead to very interesting conversations about those disagreements. But yeah, good communication, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think that good communication on all sides is what we're coming, and the importance of judgment, I think, and you build up judgment. It comes through experience, I think, of working in the system. There is a couple of other comments and questions that we could use comment on. I could draw into the conversation here. One, I think, is really relevant to the contemporary situation, and will possibly be picked up in a couple of the panels later on in the week, but it's well worth raising here. And that's the experience that you have had as editors or as reviewers of having too many requests to review, or having too many of your peer reviewers receiving too many reviews, and not being able to undertake them because of the system at the moment. So is there a kind of trend at the moment because of the pandemic, because of the increased workloads, because, as I think Sarah said, this is largely done in good faith and for nothing? Is there a strain apparent in the system? So maybe Carl, I'll turn to you, and then Jill.
I think there is real strain in the system, and I don't have an easy answer to that. I think, and some people are more conscientious as reviewers than others. They spend more time, and I think people have to be a little patient. The pandemic has had uneven impacts on people, and that, as an editor, I've seen. So I've seen some people who have care responsibilities, who may themselves have been ill, who have big sort of day job workloads that have gone up. But I also see other people who seem to be churning out a lot of research as well. And that unevenness is not easy to manage, I find.
I think that clarity is really helpful, because I think that intuitively and anecdotally, that's what I've been observing as well. What I try and do when I receive requests to review something that I know I can't undertake is I won't put it on my pile of emails to do. I'll just respond as quickly as I can with a couple of suggestions of who might be able to take it on. Jill, you're nodding.
Yeah, well, with my peer reviewers hat on, I accept that you do get too many requests. I always try and say, yes, if I can, but it's true that they're building up. But with my editor's hat on, it's a real pain because it's becoming extremely difficult to get enough peer reviews because everybody is turning you down because they have too much pressure. So it's you know, think of the poor editor who now has to write to 10 people rather than 5 people to get it. And it's where we are. I don't have a solution to it. You just have to, everybody has to work a bit harder, which is unfortunate.
That's a great point, actually, because it does increase the work on the editor. So I think it helps to understand the whole system, and that what you're doing is moving problems around it sometimes. Sarah.
Well, I think that's right. And I think that the more when you're entering into the publishing process, the more you can try to think about it from your editor and your publisher's point of view, the more constructive and helpful everybody is going to find the process, because they're not out there to make your life miserable. Everybody's trying to get a job done. But ultimately, you do have a judgment call to make, and it is balancing everybody's, but this is a judgment call we have to make every single minute of every single day in this career, is balancing our commitment to the field with the demands that are being made on us. And that's a reality. We're constantly juggling that. So when if you're being asked to do too much, and you are not required to say yes to everything. You are never required to say yes to everything. You also don't want to get in a position where you've overcommitted and you actually are letting people down, which I have done. I will put my hand up and say I've done that. I've overestimated what I could get done. And then I've let people down. And that's a much worse situation than having just said no in the first place. If I'd been realistic about my own abilities and how much I was putting on my plate. So that's something that's been a hard lesson for me to learn as I get more experienced in my career, is to learn to say no, because it's in everybody's best interest to do so. But as you say, you don't just say no, it's your problem. You try to suggest somebody who can help and try to juggle that and try to say yes enough, but recognizing that the whole thing doesn't have to fall on you, and there's no great answer. It's just a series of judgment calls with everybody trying to do their best, which is a really inadequate answer, but it's where we are.
But it also, Sarah, demonstrates the need for professionalism, because it's a system that relies on the contributions of so many people. And a comment in the chat just pointed out, well, how long is a long time to wait for a review? Yes, we know that. I mean, I know that editors are working hard to get reviews to their authors as quickly as they can, but sometimes they simply can't. So there, I don't know if you want to comment on that. Those of you who are editors, Jill, do you want to comment on?
Well, it's how long is a piece of string?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
you're really dependent on the reviewers, but it is probably helpful if something goes on longer than 6 weeks or so to write to the author and explain the situation, which we try to do, to say, look, we couldn't get reviewers and it took a lot of time and this person has asked for an extension. And I think if people know the situation, rather than just hanging there wondering, why is nobody writing to me, that does alleviate some of the pain.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very helpful comment. And it's not always the case that journals or publishers do that, but I think keeping communication open is always a very, very important principle. I think we've got time for 2 final questions, and I thought I've just pulled these out of the chat. One of them is slightly more negative and the other is slightly more positive. One is, what do you do when you get a review where you suspect the reviewer is gatekeeping or policing a certain area? Does that chime with you, Carl? Have you handled reviews where you think there's more than just a critical review, but kind of vested interest coming in, I suppose, or a kind of sense of gatekeeping of a field? Has that come up?
I don't think I can't think of any examples where it's really come up. I mean, I have been in situations where what I will say is that there are when a paper comes in a particular subject, there are some people who I don't think that would be a good choice of reviewer for that paper. Simply because I kind of know where they're coming from. Sometimes that can be useful to have that perspective. Sometimes though you can decide, no, I just don't feel that it's a really fair match between peer reviewer and the paper. Or if I do use that a peer reviewer that I feel may have a particular perspective like that, maybe a gatekeeper or a political view about where a paper is coming from, I would want to try to choose a reviewer who has quite a different take, or that I know will have quite a different take. I mean, social and legal studies is quite a politically engaged, it sees itself as quite politically engaged. So there have been papers that can generate, you know, not really big P politics, but you know, issues around. A good example for us is we describe ourselves as a journal devoted to grounded theory. So if a paper comes in that's not terribly grounded, some reviewers will just say, no, this is not what we do. It's too high. The theory's too, what's this got to do with anything? Others will be more sympathetic. So those are the sorts of issues I've had to deal with.
So this is a question of editorial judgment again in selecting peer review. Also bear in mind, because fields and subjects and disciplines are always changing. So in a sense, you want to get a rounded balance of paper that's landing on your desk. I think that's really important. And there are moments where gatekeeping might be going on in a discipline because the discipline itself is going through a disciplinary shift. But your peer reviewers and your editors will probably already know that. So it's how they handle it. So let's end with a slightly more positive comment, and that is, what are your tips for authors as you prepare your papers and your articles, bearing in mind it's going to face this peer review process? So standing a little bit back from the process, is there top tips for authors? And I'm going to turn to Sarah first, as somebody I always think of as an incredibly active and dynamic writer, and a store of incredible good sense. So you're off the top of your head.
Off the top of my head. I think that what Carl said is absolutely right, particularly when we're ECRs. It is very tempting to try to rush into publication. We think we're ready and we want to get it out there. A good scholarly article takes time. It just does. And it takes reflection, and it takes cooking and percolating and all of that stuff. So that's why the critical friend is so important. I think that most of us develop, I mean, I now have like a standing first reader. We exchange with each other. We have been doing this with each other for years. A lot of people develop that. Find somebody who you trust and work with them. So I would say, take the time to make sure that you're confident that it's where it needs to be. And related to that, the other important point is that you're sending it to the right place. Absolutely what everybody said about reading the journal where you're sending it to. Read a lot of their articles and then read yours again and ask, does mine fit in there? Does it sit right there? And if it doesn't, rethink. I think those are the two most important things. And then the absolute bottom line with all of it, and it goes to the point about vested interest and gatekeeping as well. When in doubt, every single step of the way, be professional, be tactful. Remember, these are human beings, and you're all trying to get to a positive outcome here.
That's great advice. Absolutely fantastic. And I couldn't agree more. I don't know if there is a better last word than Sarah's from Jill and Carl, but I offer you a challenge.
No, that's fine.
Yes.
I agree with that. Those are the important points.
Yeah, I agree with that. Writing is a craft.
Yeah.
So and try to enjoy that crafting. I personally, I don't enjoy a blank page, blank screen, but I do enjoy just trying to craft a sentence as just as good as I think I can be, and try to aim for that.
Indeed, it is one of the pleasures of academic work. The only thing that I would add to what everybody said is, and I think it's just as a way of amplifying what's already been said, share your work as soon as you can, because the sooner it's read, the sooner you'll get a sense of what's going right and what's going wrong. So We have come to 1:45. I'd like, sorry, 12:45. We're out of time. I can't thank our panelists, Sarah Churchwell, Carl Stychin and Jill Kraye enough for a really helpful, I think, panel on peer review. Please do sign up for the panels later in the week. And in the meantime, thank you so much again. I think I learned a lot. I think we all need refreshers on this. So this was really helpful.
And good luck to everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah, good
good
luck.
luck. Good luck with your writing. Thanks so
Bye.
much.